Good evening to one and all present here. It's a delight to have you, Ms. Kagumire. Ever since we came across your profile and literally were researching about you everywhere, listened to your speeches, listened to your work, saw your work, read your work. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us today. I'd like to introduce Professor Nishad Zedi, who's the chair for the valedictory address. And Just give me a second. Right. So, Professor Nishad Zedi is the honorary director of the Sarojini Naidu Centre for Women's Studies at Jamia Millia Islamia, a professor of English and the former head at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. She has authored, translated, edited more than 20 books and has successfully supervised a number of PhDs. And some of her recent publications include The Vernacular, three essays on an ambiguous concept, Ocean's Method, a historical play translation of Premchand's play Karbala with a critical introduction and notes, Literary Cultures and Digital Humanities in India with Sean A. Poe, Rutledge 2022. First in literature, Aga Shahid Ali. Um,
That's fine. That's fine,
that
Chetali.
from knowledge to modernism, Syed thank you for being uh, the chair today. And now I would like to take it from here to give a very,
Let me say a few words, and then let
yeah,
me say a few
sure,
words. After
sure,
that, you
sure,
introduce. Yeah, yeah. Thank you
sure,
so
ma'am.
much. A very warm welcome to all of you to this valedictory session. Uh, we had 2 days of very productive, very enriching, and also to some extent tiring, uh, days of conferencing, dialogues, discussions, presentations. We had 9 technical sessions and roughly 58 to 60 paper presentations, 5 keynotes, and two plenary sessions. So obviously it was a very, very packed schedule that we have had over the last 2 days. And now we are here for the much awaited moment, which is the valedictory. And all valedictories are moments of satisfaction, gratification, reflection, and also sad moments, because things that you had been working for, planning, all that is now coming to an end. But yes, as I said earlier also, when we began planning this conference, we did not imagine that it would take this shape and this magnitude. We had very modest planning, but as we started receiving abstracts from presenters from across the world, especially from Global South, and that has been the most satisfactory aspect of this conference, that we have had papers from South Africa, from Sri Lanka, from Latin America. So we really, really managed to cover the Global South that we wanted to cover, and what could be better than having a Rosebell to address our valedictory address, because once I was talking to a publisher and she said that usually people talk about Global South, but all presentations end up being from India. So, so I'm so happy that this is not the case with this conference. So thank you so much, Roseville, and your intervention has been very inspiring. As my, Chaitali mentioned, that we have been researching and we've been exploring the kind of work that you are doing. And it's very important for us from our location here in India to connect and to interact with South African feminist movements, and the kind of work that you all are doing from different countries in Africa, not just South Africa. So thank you so much. I welcome you on this occasion. I welcome all the rapporteurs, my colleagues here, my co-organizers. I mean, you all make me so proud. I don't have words to describe that. I mean, they have handled everything in the most amazing way possible. So thank you so much, and over to you, Rosebell. But before that, Chaitali will formally introduce you.
Thank you, ma'am. Would like to take it from here and introduce Ms. Rosebell Kagumire. She's a seasoned journalist, rights advocate, and feminist activist with extensive experience in the print, TV, and online media. She is a digital strategist, content producer, public speaker, and co-editor of the book Challenging Patriarchy: The Role of Patriarchy in the Rollback of Democracy. She also co-authored the book I Am Nala, focusing on education and reproductive justice. Her writing has appeared in international media like New Internationalist, The Guardian, AI, Jazeera, Quartz. Recognized by Evans Media as one of the 100 most influential women in Africa 2021 edition. She has also been honored with the 2018 Anna QA, if I pronounced right, Award for Digital Democracy and Equality by activists, and is a World Economic Forum Young Leader. Rosebell's expertise spans media, gender, human rights, peace, security, and all social matters. Over to you, Ms. Kagumire. We're so delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chantal, for that introduction. I'm from Uganda, and I currently live in Dakar, Senegal, in West Africa. So I am tuning in from Dakar right now. Thank you for this invitation and for the work of this convening. Indeed, the invitation for me to look at African movement, to look at movement building, digital resistance, and how are we reimagining our feminist resistance on the continent, and connections with other global South movements is what I'm going to be looking at. And most of my experience really is a writer. As a writer on feminist movements and a documenter in documenting movements, I am an editor for AfricanFeminism.com, which is a website where we really track on feminist gains or regression on the continent and in African diaspora and all the connections. For me to start is really to recognize that digital activism and resistance is really rooted in long histories of resistance across the world. And for the African continent, of course, we see that women have always been resisting and fighting for their rights, and that in many ways our fight today is rooted in is very shaped very much with the fact that our societies were colonized, and a lot of our belief systems, a lot of our gender systems were actually uprooted and replaced by colonial imaginations of gender, which in many cases were not actually in line with what communities on the African continent and elsewhere in colonized lands look like. So Africa has a very diverse population then and even now. The fact that there were many traditional African societies that had complex gender relations, and that gender was not always binary as we see today with the colonial kind of the legacies that we are fighting as feminist movements, and the fact that oftentimes we had very many matriarchal societies, and where gender relations and power dynamics were not as we see today. I would reflect on one of the most inspiring feminists on the continent, Professor Sylvia Tamale, who is a Ugandan academic. And she wrote recently a book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, which is really, really powerful, and rooting on different African feminist battles and how they relate with the global South. And she was reflecting on the impact of colonization on the African women in the continent, and the current continent struggle to overcome the legacies of colonization. And for me, what stands out and what should inform our work and our struggle is that we must understand, we must appreciate really fully on what colonization did to our countries. And I quote her, she said that bolstered by religion, law, education, and reconstructed cultures, colonization not only reinvented notions of men in quotes and women in quotes in Africa, but but also the way that they related to each other. Imperialism dealt a double blow to women. First of all, women suffered as Africans who had been robbed of their resources, freedom, and pride under colonization, but also as people whose status then had sharply regressed with colonization, and how colonization demanded the subjugation of women even further. So it's very important to reflect that indeed our struggle is rooted very much in the struggle of so many women and so many gender diverse people on the continent, and the feminism that we espouse is really in that, and recognizing that we are building on the long struggle of what others have built. So digital feminism is not that different. So for me, it's very important to always look at the work that has been done outside the digital world, because without looking at that, we will not be building on anything. We have to build on that. And also, it's at a time like this when we see a lot of a rise of what purports to be feminism, really an advance of cisgender and heterosexuality. In a way, we need to reiterate the fact that feminism has always been, like Angela Davis says, a radical struggle that challenges all systems of inequality and oppression, particularly perpetuated by patriarchy, racism, and capitalism, and all the isms that we look at. That feminism involves so much more than gender equality. We see the struggle or the attempts to make feminism equal to gender equality, but really feminism is much larger than the current efforts that are looking at gender equality and trying to replace every time to insert the word feminism. But when you really look down on what the work that's being done, is really not feminist. It's really just under the cloak of gender equality. That we are reminded that it involves so much more than gender equality. It's so much more than a critique of patriarchy, because Professor Angela Davis reminds us that it's fundamentally anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-heterosexist. So it's very important that any work that is not encompassing all these fundamentally harmful systems that societies across the world run on is really running short of that. And I would also reflect the fact that Africa is not homogeneous, and this is very important, because oftentimes people hope to just it's rooted in colonial legacy, or to be honest, to kind of box Africa into this one homogeneous, like it's the same everywhere, like Africans are this and that. But Africa is not homogeneous. It has over 2,000 plus distinct, unique ethnicities and nations, which have been shaped also in their own unique ways. And that means that the women's struggles, or the struggle for the feminist struggles in those nations, will also look slightly different, even when our foundations are very much the same. So, but at the end of the day, it's recognizing that African women before colonization had always been traders, spiritual healers, mediums, custodians of culture. They were leaders. They have always been leaders in medicine, technology, medicine, knowledge, and technology, and research in health and arts and music and innovation, all facets of life, which then you see under colonization, everything being separated, and the idea that women belong to this place or women belong here. So it's very, very important. And the current struggles we see on the continent, for example, where there is this evolving discourse around like African values, like we're trying to defend African values, but that in itself is defeatist because there's no single African value. Different African countries, nations have always had their different values. They might overlap and might be related, but ultimately there's no single African value. And usually the debate around African values is used to alienate the struggle for queer liberation on the continent. And we are reminded that gender expression and identity have always been diverse on the continent. In my own country, in Uganda, among the Langu people, there's and many other languages, we see that there's explicit language that is not derogatory, that defines effeminate males and masculine women in a way that's to show that these gender expressions have always been in the culture, that the words exist actually, and the fact that alternative gender status have always existed without the tension that we see, and understanding that the tensions are very much imported and imposed by colonial and imperial relations that we have all suffered. So when we think of then digital feminisms, it's important to know that those digital feminists are really building on those long histories, whether pre-colonial or during colonization, where women were actively protesting the colonial impositions, from taxes to demand to be included in education. All those things have always been here, and we have so many histories of struggle. And particularly when we also look in the media and the representation of women or African women, we see the struggle today where majority of African women for a long time had always been, and probably mostly in all colonized lands, women looked at as something to be rescued as victims, but very much without unpacking on really what makes them victims then, and all the while undermining the agency of the very people. But we also know there's always been a history of documenting women's lives as a whole, and we see as far back as 1926, there were Pan-African magazines like Awa from Senegal, which were really trying to document Pan-African political consciousness and in the diaspora, and having a monthly magazine that captured the lives of women, African women, African women under the colonial empire. So it's very, very important to know that the documentation, the movement building that we see online today is building on that history of very much history that we have in our countries. And we all know that African women, some of the first African feminist magazines were in Africa. We remember El Fatah, which means young women, which was the first feminist magazine in Africa, published by Hind in Alexandria in Egypt in 1892. So it's it's to say that technology, knowledge, and all this, women have always been at the center of documenting and creating spaces in Africa, so that they could share with the with other parts of the society on what their struggle really looked like. So for me, I drew that a lot on that, and also knowing what then today are we fighting for, having known the history of colonization. And I think then I would share what Professor Oyeronke Oyewomo, who is a Nigerian professor, who's one of the leading feminist thinkers on the continent reminded us that when you think of what has happened as a result of colonization of this continent, it is that men have garnered all resources that were not even traditionally in the hands of men or women. These were collectively owned things. But one man now will take it all and take it for himself. What I see, what I call cultures of impunity that colonization represented. Because if you remember colonization, it's about taking away your sovereignty, and the colonizers did whatever they wanted. And so they did lay out institutions that run still today that were responsible were not responsive to the colonized. So we still live very much in a time that full decolonization has not happened. And that's why feminism is very key, is very important as a movement, because it was a movement then, it was a movement in colonization, pre-colonization. It is going to still be a movement that is very, very relevant because we have not decolonized many facets of the society. And in a way, that means that the place of women and other gender minorities is still in a very bad place, that we need to continue to work on it. So that's where I think African feminism, African resistance on the dicto, when the dicto comes in, that's where we see the African women and gender diverse people actually fight on the basis of what has come before. And I think it was Amina Mama who reminded us, who's a feminist and academic, who is Nigerian British, that African liberated states have never liberated women. It has been an edifice of male complicity engaged in pacification forever, whether it's colonial, post-colonial, neoliberal, or theocratic. So in all countries you see is that we have never really liberated women, and that informs the kind of wave that we see of digital resistance in Africa. So it's very important to know that women and have always had that relationship with technology, even in African women. So then when you see the advent of technologies, you see women, even if they are on the margins, having not much education in the 70s, in the 80s, the few that were there were getting very much inspired and also connected to see how technology was shaping feminisms and also how feminisms could shape technology. I think that was then, but it's also very applicable today with what we are dealing with monopolies of technological big tech empires that are taking over most of the discourse or the platforms that we hold on, and that struggle is still real on how then feminisms can shape technology, and what can we deconstruct, and what kind of feminist politics can we infuse in the current struggles with these technology platforms? This has always been a feminist question. It's not new. It's just only on a very, very massive scale. So it's within that you see also African feminism joining other feminism in the world to critique and how technology shapes the world and how technology impacts not only the progress but also the future. And as feminists struggle to change the material conditions of very many people on the continent, whether it's from political participation, whether it's in women's involvement in technology development, whether it's in how then the digital impacts on the very struggle to develop as women and gender expansive people. This is still the struggle today, where we see that the internet has provided a platform for us to exchange information, to read far beyond. It's now unimaginable amount like access that has never happened before for education, and a lot of this had always been through a very narrow Western introduced education system, while a lot of informal education was always discarded and not put at the same level. We see that digital platforms are bringing back this reminder that all information, all ways of knowing should all be on the table, and people are sharing. They're using different platforms to really advance all these marginal knowledges that we might not have been privy to in the past few years, in the past decades. So we also know that that there's no longer just the virtual world in the real world, right? That all these they kind of mesh into each other. It creates a unique questions of whether from identity, identity, questions of identity. So, for example, people who live in the very strict countries where gender and sexuality and expression are very banned or criminalized. The internet and social media in Africa gave them a place where they could be actually themselves, even anonymously, but they could live an experience that they have never lived in their own cultures or in their own society. So that has been the power of the digital world, that you can make different realities real that might not be actually in the real world for the whole society. And from that point, then people start finding their own kind of audiences, but also kind of communities. The idea of community being only a community in terms of boundaries and same beliefs, then it's being redefined on the internet, because then for those who live excluded on the margins in their own cultures can make societies, can make communities beyond the physical limits. And we've seen the internet, many African women and feminists using it to really make fun of power, challenge power, and at the same time kind of dethrone power and build new power. We see movements to end to criminalize gender-based violence. We see movements to end discrimination of women in schools. We have seen movements, anti-racist movements online. For example, in many schools in Africa, Black children were not allowed to grow their hair. And we see very many movements stemming out of that, informed by feminist struggles that challenge, lasting legacies of colonization around Black women's hair and Black children's hair, and the ability for the Black body to not be policed as a colonial, and understanding that as a function of colonial mentality that was left behind. And we see so many other. Of course, we see a lot of content production no longer being a prism of media, so that women can define themselves. Whereas in many places, people got information about others through very sieved media hierarchies that were often controlled by men and still controlled by men. But I think the platforms have given us a way to circumvent that and show the different facets of lives of women. And we see this on platforms like, whether from TikTok to Instagram, we see African young women and other gender diverse persons actually able to show their life and say, I exist, and this is how I exist, and outside of the confines of what society demands me to be. So it's very, very important. Photography, video have been very powerful in showing a reality that I don't think generations before would have actually seen or expressed themselves in that way. But also we see social media playing a very big role in social movements. So whether it's in North Africa, what is called Arab Spring, but in North Africa, those movements, and we have seen movements across. We see from Nigeria, we saw anti-police brutality movements in Nigeria in 2020. We've seen in South Africa large movements on Fees Must Fall, about education and reform and decolonizing education in South Africa. We have seen also Roads Must Fall, like put down the statues of colonizers. We have seen movements to rename reclaim history and rename spaces, public spaces, according to African histories, not the history of the colonizer, that often the streets up to this day, streets, national parks, lakes, anything that is really defining, very attached to public, definition is still very much colonial. But we see the movements in different parts of the continent. We see a lot of pushes in the Francophone speaking countries against French colonization, which really continues up to this day, as many of the people, all these countries still use a currency which is called the CFA, that is printed and controlled by France. So their economies are still very much controlled by France directly. And this is not to say that other economies are not, of course, under the control of many international global systems. But in this particular case, for French-speaking countries, the countries are still very much, their economies are tied to the French economy, and the France gets to determine, to the printing of the currency is still done in France, and their economy is being impacted. So this is very much a very big part of the feminist struggles on the continent. Also decolonization not being something very, very present, because that's the sheer amount of power that France holds over, whether from education, businesses, financial sector, is very much still shaped by France in French-speaking countries of Africa. So that is a very alive anti-colonial movement that is still not very much anti-colonial movement that is alive, that feminists are taking part in on the continent. There's so many really examples I could share on the different ways in which Africans are really resisting online. And we see that whether it's in debate, we've always had media that elevates men's voices over everybody else. We see new media platforms being emerging. We run AfricanFeminism.com. There are platforms like Ayala Blog. There are platforms like, we've seen initiatives like Quote This Woman from South Africa, and platforms called like Gender It, really documenting women's realities and gender diverse persons, and telling their stories, and in a way being the alternative voices and alternative platforms that many people have not heard. We see, using online and communing online having an impact in terms of how people are formulating new ideas and producing feminist, what we can call feminist counter publics. You find that feminists have their own communities, right? And they can be able to generate content and force the mainstream to pay attention to the demands that for a long time have been exclusionary. So we know how exclusionary nature of many mainstream media platforms, but we see that has been very impactful in how then young people also move and build on these platforms that had existed from the long times of blogging, to using petition platforms to be heard, to bring issues of different countries or different women. We saw in terms of peace and security, what women in Sudan did in terms of deposing Omar al-Bashir's regime in 2019, and African Sudanese feminists being able to document their own contributions to that moment, to that revolution. We see that we see hashtags emerging like Nigerian Queer Lives Matter, Ghanaian Queer Lives Matter, in terms of amplifying the lives of queer people in those countries. In Kenya, we had movements like My Dress, My Choice, where we saw people trying to police women's choice of dressing. We saw in total shutdown in South Africa, Kenya, and Namibia. We saw the Women's March in Uganda. Then examples like from Uganda, which I worked on, was a campaign on Free Stella Nyanzi. Nyanzi, being one of the leading feminist voices in Uganda, had challenge the president. We have had the same president for the last 38 years. So living in a dictatorship like that, oftentimes challenging power comes at a big cost. So she was arrested for writing poems against the president. And she chose a manner in which she was going to speak to the president, which is not, civilized, accepted way, but building on decades of what we call vulgar, really looking at using the to use vulgar language to destabilize power, really to say that we shall not respect you, we shall not respect the rules of how to address you. And that has always been in the histories of Uganda. From colonization, we saw people using that a radical means of attacking power through language and descriptors that was unsettling people in power, and that is still used. And she reminded us that that is still a technique you can use, that being feminist means being radical and not towing what is always expected. We've seen attempts in Kenya to repeal what we call 162. It's the penal code, which was passed down from Britain, that criminalizes same-sex relations. But we have also seen very successful challenges in Botswana to decriminalize homosexuality. We have seen successful campaigns, for example, in Benin recently to decriminalize abortion. And we have seen also wins in Namibia, where we see Namibia pushing to recognize same-sex parents, families where they are having a child. And all these are being tasted and also a lot of mobilization happening online. So we need to see that at the end of the day, all these are happening because of the Pan-Africanist nature, that when these movements are happening because of technology, they are not just happening in that community. They might begin there, but the amplification starts there. So from the early adopters of organizations in Africa, which were very skilled in terms of to create counter publics online for African feminist discourse, like platforms like Pambazuka, to now where the platforms have multiplied. There's always been, the digital world has always been a place where African movements have flourished and pushed. But at the same time, it's very important to know that technological development is no exception to power relations. And as we are learning, as we see the move towards the right of most power, those who are holding power and owning technology platforms, large political platforms that we are working on, is that we're having a very big regression. So then we enter into the time of disintegration of what had been built. So a lot of people had built power through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, but all these platforms are being threatened with censorship, right-wing politics. We see anti-women, anti-gender content being amplified, while feminist voices are being silenced. So that is a very unique moment right now, a very difficult moment we are in. After having a decade or so of using platforms in a more, they want the most democratic, but it was much more easier than today. So we have more access, but we see technology companies kind of stripping away the rights, or even the being a challenge to feminist gaze, because we are seeing access, use, and design of ICT being configured right now, and it's very important that African feminists and Africans and feminists in the global South continue to be engaging and in the material reality of the global political economy that we know it, of these new technologies, so that we know that the digital divide is still there, the gender digital divide in most of the global South. So it's not only between men and women and other people, but also between the North, East, and some countries and the global South. So it's very important. We've seen the online platforms being used to explain the exploitative nature and conditions of these technologies. For example, we see Facebook facing big cases in Kenya of exploitation of workers who are content moderators who have no support whatsoever, but they are subjected to reviewing some of the most graphic, videos, content without any support. And there's been really repercussions in terms of mental health of very many young people that really were rushing to get jobs in these technology companies. So all these are feminist struggles, really. And at the end of the day, we also see massive disinformation and fear, which is alongside the rise of populism and anti-rights leadership in countries like America, but also a lot of growing right-wing politics in Europe and other countries, and populist leaders across also in the global south themselves. So that the rise of such leaders comes with repercussions for feminist struggles, and that is that the fight is online. We see use of laws like defamation, to curtail freedom of expression. We see criminalization of different populations, but also disinformation really campaigns from powerful networks that can really sink the discourse for feminist gains that we had seen. So we see this kind of demonization, the binary of demonization and celebrating online feminism. Before COVID, we saw a lot of people say, oh, whenever you were working online, they say you are just an online feminist, that you have no impact. But that was really superficial way of looking at the power of online digital platforms. And indeed, people found out the hard way when COVID-19 pandemic hit, and all they were remaining with was online world to explore, to actually keep connected and alive and know what was going on. This is when they appreciated actually the work that many African young feminists were doing online to inform, to keep informed, run platforms, because there was not a time where people were forced to be online than COVID-19 lockdowns in Africa and the rest of the world. So post-COVID, we see a lot of bump in people really being online, but that comes with very many different harms, right? So it's very important to know that the digital world has allowed feminists, has given the platforms and the connections and the communities for African feminists to do transnational, Pan-Africanist and diaspora organizing. Whether it's 2020, we saw the murder of George Floyd in the US and the spark of anti-racist protest across the world, including in African countries. So that discourse also was something in terms of diaspora and connection in Africa, in terms of then our own actually police brutality in the origins and the colonial origins of that police brutality, and connecting to, for example, the movement in Nigeria and other countries. So we see a lot of communities emerging because of these technologies, but also the new technologies giving particular difficulties and new violences, like technology-assisted violence, of course, is big, from image-based violence to deep fakes and stealing of identity. So we have a lot of battles right now, like from representation to legal to identity online. It's also really challenging for now or online organizing. But otherwise, we've seen a lot of mass mobilization from the African feminist networks, even amidst the rising of anti-gender platforms, because the anti-gender platforms like Citizen Go, like a lot of petition platforms, are based in the north, but they are targeted to Africa, to use on issues in Africa, legal issues, political and policy issues. So Citizen Go posts petitions in African countries, targeting abortion rights, targeting the comprehensive sexuality education, targeting technology-assisted reproductive treatment, so that to make these like to make them look like a controversy, so that they can take away rights of many people, when these are issues that communities and countries should be able to discuss in a manner that is to advance rights, not to take away rights. But we see that constantly platforms, technologies being imported to do harm on the continent, and they're doing harm on the generations of struggles that we have been through, and really complicating further complicating our own intergenerational contestations of resources and power, and that will be, we are in that kind of moment right now, where we see anti-gender rights rising. We at the same time, the movements connected to those billionaires that are owning the platforms, and then the disintegration of feminist publics online. So people who are, for example, on Twitter are no longer on Twitter because it became extremely toxic. It's no longer feasible to even have a conversation there. So then people are having a conversation. Where do you fall back? And that's why I think for them, websites and networks that have existed, making closed communities, WhatsApp communities, Telegram communities, where they can have this conversation safely, is one of the ways. But ultimately, the challenge is like, how do we get back to the digital organizing in a way that would be safe? Right now, in many cases, it's not safe. It is safe. It is really mentally taxing because of the sheer amount of bots that are paid to kind of drown your own information. So those are the kind of challenges that we're seeing, both the political economy of technologies, but the actual how the activists on the continent are connecting with us, still continue to connect with others, but all these challenges are really challenges of the global south, not just Africa. That's what I can share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rosebell. That was fascinating. I mean, in your talk, you have given us an overview of the situation in entire continent, which includes from Uganda to South Africa to Botswana to so many other countries, which are so different also in many ways, but have often been clubbed together and presented as though the entire continent is just one whole. So this was fascinating, and you also talked about the legacies of colonialism, which continue, in our lives and are being experienced by women more than men, because men have sort of taken, especially elite men, what Googie calls comprador classes. They have taken the legacy of colonialism, and women remain at the receiving end. And then you talked about how technology, especially digital technology, proved to be empowering for women, but at the same time it is posing its own threats. And if we compare what you just presented to us, if we compare these situations with India, yesterday we had Professor Catherine Schroff, who was talking about neoliberal activism, where activism is also related to economy, and very often it is the elite women who sort of grab the limelight, and activism is so there is a diversity of classes, even among women. Just as Africa is not a homogeneous whole, African women are not a homogeneous whole, as in India, Indian women are not a homogeneous whole. So these are challenges. Who is speaking for whom, who is representing whom, who are the people at the forefront of these movements, what are the resources that they have, resources, access to technology, literacy, what kind of resources they have, and who are these people who do not have resources. So are they getting represented in the way they would like to be represented? Do they have a voice? So these are the questions that probably you in working in your location, and we working in our location, are confronted with every day. And so would you like to add something to that? I can see that there are questions in the chat box, so you can probably respond to that, and then we'll go to the chat box. But thank you so much. I mean, this is really, really fascinating.
Thank you so much, Nishat. Indeed, very much looking at who is heard and who is not heard. is still very much understanding that the access is based on class. Class is a very big thing, and of course questioning class and you know. It's talking about class suicide is one of the very important tenets of feminism, and looking at who is still getting access. So before, when you see the rise of women's rights organizations or really formal organizing in the neoliberal sense, who is getting money in the funding models, were always like educated women who have had access education. Always, maybe they've gone out of their country and made these connections, because we are in a very much imperial neoliberal model of economy, global economy. So then they get access to that. We see that also that neoliberal model was used to pacify African social movements, including women's rights movements, right? So that's why you find you have women's rights organizations and movements in Africa that are very, very homophobic, and they can pass a law. In Uganda, recently we had a agitation to pass a sexual offences law, and when the government was pushing the women who are drafting this law on certain bits of it, the government wanted to include homophobic and gay laws and targeting same-sex. They were willing to accept that as long as the sexual offences law came, and that is not feminist, and that is the way the kind of the lobbying and the kind of class it creates. It makes sure that it creates a class that women are going to cut this kind of compromises that are going to throw many communities under the bus. The law was not even recognizing sex work as work. If you can't have feminist gains, there can't be a sexual offences law that still target sex workers, and that is progress. It is not progress. You're not going to progress far. Even if you're getting one, it's one step forward, one step back. So indeed, we see these kind of things like where the mainstream organizing what is supposedly feminist is really not feminist enough, and not inclusive of other people who are even further historically marginalized, queer people, sex workers. Many other people living on the margins, women living in informal settlements, rural women. We see the creation of different tiers, right? Where an educated woman is to be prized and have the front row, and then the assumption that the power of that one woman can be distributed downwards, and it's not working, that kind of hierarchical. So it's very important. I think the digital, and also we come from societies that are ageist in a way that they actually benefit older women, because older is experienced, it's respected. So when you're younger, you're not respected, you have no voice. So I think what the digital platforms did was that to give young women, for example, even if the young women are still maybe classed in a way that they have an education, even if they don't have resources. So even in the way we see class in Africa or global South can be very different from how class is described in Western hegemonic societies, because someone can be educated, but they don't have actually the resources. They can be struggling as good as someone who has not gone to school, yet in many other social issues, they have a social capital over an uneducated person. So that's how we have to be able to see the complexity of how class is constructed for us. And always you can have social capital like visibility, but actually you don't. We have this saying in Uganda that most people are actually what we see as education as successful. You're like one illness away from falling back to poverty, because even if you're educated, you have money, you're in a system where there's no guarantee to education. You still pay out of pocket. There's no public services. There's no hospital, public healthcare. So it means that anything that can happen to you can be really in 2 minutes can still be at the worst levels you were like 20 years ago. So then that calls us to really be careful in how we are evaluating when we are examining class and its impact, right? But for digital platforms and who is being had, I think that queer in Africa, we have seen queer organizations be visible for the first time because of the digital. And they would never have been visible if we continued with mainstream organizing. because they are not being heard by women's rights organizations, even when they claim they were feminists. But with the digital, they have been able to create their own networks. Literally, in many countries in Africa, queer organizing is very parallel to women's rights movements. So as a person who is a storyteller who works with different movements, it's so often amazing to see how queer movements, of course, to organize in a world where you're criminalized is even much harder than you, who's a woman, who say, oh, we only have this percentage in parliament, we would like to get this. But this person is not, their existence is not even recognized. So I find that they have techniques and they have like really like practice that could benefit the whole movement, but because there's still this tension, the women's mainstream movement still wants government to give them some favors and still be seen to be decent, not really being closer to like the queer movement. You find these tensions there, and you find that we are losing a lot because there's enough knowledge, there's enough experience, but because there's still who wants to access which power determines how they are going to play. But I think that in many young people's movements, we see the crossover. We see a lot of queer young women in the women's movement being vocal, actually leading the women's movement, which is very, very important. They are not put in a box that, oh, I'm queer and I'm not going to be in this movement, but they come and take up space and make the women, the cis women's movements uncomfortable, which is very, very important. And also by being visible online, they have profiles, we're following them on Twitter, they can critique that very movement publicly. So I think that the platforms have been able to give them, they have their own platforms. For example, in Uganda, they have a platform called Kuchu Times, where they storytell stories of queer Ugandans, right? So even if you claim what, you can see them. Their media has become even more, with more attacks, it's become even more visible. So you cannot say you don't know anything about it like they used to say in the past. So the invisibilization, fighting invisibilization for young people, queer people, it has paid off in ways that before they could be denied their very existence. So once they are visible, then the country, even in the most homophobic of places, even when we have a case, a law that really calls for death penalty for same-sex relations, young queer people are still visible and still organizing and still forcing the government, for example, that they have to put special clinics to provide healthcare, even in that kind of restrictive environment, to put special clinics for men who have sex with men. So to continue to be not only identity, but also issues and policies, and daring to go to parliament, daring to go to platforms and say we need healthcare, HIV is a big issue, and it's because of these inequalities. We see all this being possible. To be honest, the power of being visible and to fight as erasure is very powerful. So yes, class is a very big thing. Class, and also of course there are other, when you go to different countries, there are caste systems. For example, in West African countries, there's a legacies of caste systems, and women from original lower castes cannot be visible. And the issue of caste is less discussed in feminist movements in West Africa. When you live in those countries, you realize the reality that the caste has an impact on how women the social mobility of women is determined by the caste, even when it is not discussed publicly. This is things that people practice, and as a feminist movement, these have to be front. So indeed, there are different aspects in other countries. If you're Muslim woman in a non-Muslim majority country, then you have issues. So, for example, we see organizations like Musawa documenting and advocating for rights of women living in Muslim laws. So if you're Muslim woman in Uganda, you might live under a different law than me, and that can affect you, particularly different laws pertaining to domestic sphere. And if your life in the domestic sphere is really not on the same equal footing, or even far away from other women of other regions or religions or ethnicities, then it's going to affect your place a lot more in the world. So it's always important to look at those issues intersectionally in terms of who's left behind, what are the factors that are playing. Religion plays a factor, both looking at it in terms of issues like Islamophobia, but also in the very much construction of Islam in these countries that is constructed in ways that advances norms and laws and practices that hold back women. And then to see how Muslim women are using digital platforms and documenting and sharing and challenging these very regressive practices in their own domain. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, these things we don't know much about these things. For example, you mentioned caste system in African societies. We really never associate that with African societies. We think that only India has caste system. And then you mentioned the age factor, something that we usually overlook, right? How younger women and even a girl child is always treated with suspicion, or always already kind of woman right from childhood. And so this age factor, and it's very important. I think we need to pay attention to these things. So I think you've really made us think about our situations and the way African societies are similar to, in many ways, to the realities, everyday realities that Indian women are confronted with. So thank you. We can go on and on, but I can see that there are questions here in the chat box. So who is going to read questions? Because we don't have eternity. We need to finish the session, because this is a month of Ramzan and many people are fasting and so on and so forth. So so who will read the questions? Alvira or Chaitali?
Sure, ma'am.
I'll do that. I'll do. Okay. Okay, Alvira, you can go ahead. I can take it to the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these
Ma'am,
questions are for you, Rosebell. So don't go away.
No, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you so much for such an insightful lecture. It was really engaging. And yes, the similarities we found between the two societies were very thought provoking. Now, I would like to begin with the questions. The first one is posed by Chaitali Pan. It says that in the post pandemic world, we have seen how visual storytelling, especially through photo essays, has played a crucial role in bringing together different realities, shaping collective solidarities across borders. In that context, how do we see digital resistance and creative reimagination shaping Pan African solidarities within the global South? And what lessons can other regions draw from these forms of digital activism and storytelling to foster stronger transnational alliances? Should I read all the questions together, ma'am?
No, let's go one at a time because they're
Sure.
kind of long. I'm rereading to, also. This is about storytelling, especially through photo, in terms of shaping realities, digital resistance and creative imagination. Yeah, indeed, there's a lot happening around creative, not just only visual. As you know, many African cultures are oral storytelling cultures, but also very much so we see on that a lot of people doing the fusion art, using art as a prism through which to transmit feminist realities and feminist imaginations. We have many collectives on the continent, feminist art collectives that are engaged in different works, both looking at image and representation, challenging what we see as a single story of African women, and really being able to challenge this idea of victimhood and tell stories in the ways that bring agency, that someone is never totally the idea that someone is the whole life is a victimhood situation is dismantled because people draw their agency in different ways, and people have different different identities in which they could be disadvantaged or could be advantaged in different ways. So we see a lot of creative platforms, both video, photography, online, but also merging what is typically like exhibition, kind of having online exhibitions, kind of relating those two worlds increasingly with different feminist storytellers, feminist photographers, being very much of the feminist resistance movement, but also independent feminist works are very much used here. And we see a lot of crossovers, particularly with the African diaspora. We've seen a lot of crossovers from Latin America and the US and Europe in terms of art and how the art is being used in creating these stories, both physical in physical exhibitions, but also on online projects. But I also think that at the end of the day, looking at transnational, telling stories across boundaries, it's about really telling the interconnectedness of the human experience, but also particularly for the global South on surviving colonization and what remains, what didn't remain, and how do you reconstruct that while using all these tools. That digital is really a tool. The world has existed before it, and as we see, many aspects of the digital can vanish and new arise. But what remains is that people's ability to draw experiences from those moments, right? And be able to transmit those experiences across cultures, across generations. I think that's what we have to remember, that these things have always been existed, whether it was in storytelling, whether that cultures have been interconnected beyond just colonial impositions of interconnectedness. To really survive and struggle together. We see a lot of storytelling around environmental justice and ecological justice between communities in the global South, feminist storytellers doing that, because our realities are very much shaped by the colonial extraction and the position in which the kind of extractivist economy pushes many people in the global South at the edge, in the periphery, and suffering the impacts of climate change. So we see a lot of that in terms of whether it is retelling what happened in that colonization time, or even how the lasting legacies are still impacting us, but also in terms of how communities have always adapted and resisted and sharing transnational tactics of resistance and existence. I think there are very much many initiatives, and although a lot of times, it's very important to know that funding and access to experiences has always been a limitation. So I think that to be able to create these moments of exchange, platforms of exchange, whether it is an online conference, it's very, very important to have these lessons to share across the digital world. Yeah, that's what I can say there.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question is from Preeti Moria. She says that digital platforms have been a game changer in creating solidarities, bringing people of similar struggles and exploitations together. In India, as well as across global digital platforms have been a medium to reveal truth, create and run movements. But oftentimes than not, these movements are short-lived or their popularity fades in times, given the short span of attention of consumers. This leads to very insignificant on-ground change. How do you see the lifespan of such movement and the entangling of digital and what's happening on the ground? How much of an impact and difference does it create in the everyday lives of people? Please, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So I think difference comes the measurement of difference comes in different forms, to be honest, that whatever is popular or what is on the digital platforms, or what is game changing, right? For me, that the foundation of change is consciousness. right? And we are what oftentimes feminist movements are dealing with are actually entrenched generations of impact, and you cannot change them with one campaign on Addicto. You have to be realistic on what change looks like. And I think for me, in terms of information sharing and consciousness, that's where it begins, because as part of the colonization is that many people in the global south, there was this impact on how people viewed themselves. So from colonized to continue colonizing, you must think of yourself as not as having power, as having less power. You must find the most negative view of yourself, to because it's fed onto you in media, in everything, in every minute. You are fed on this, degraded idea of yourself, and you find these kind of things elsewhere in many colonized communities. And overcoming that is still a challenge. So even the engagement. So it's very important for working in the knowledge, in terms of knowledge. For me, I'm interested in how people build consciousness, because changing, yes, it's very important at the end of the day to change material conditions in which we are in, but without consciousness we can't simply pick money. While imperial countries can come to India, can come to Senegal and pick gold and go and change their realities, unfortunately, colonized people have a harder struggle. They can't just change their realities by stealing from somewhere, right? It will not happen. Of course, the relations are very difficult, but very few countries can afford to do that. So how are your economic material realities going to change? I think appreciating that consciousness is one of the very key issues, and breaking the barriers, because it's not how you feel, you think about yourself, it's also how you relate with others, how the divide and rule foundations of colonization, how do you able to create movements across the divides you found, so that you're able to demand better. I think that is beyond just a hashtag, is beyond something trending today. So for me, something trending is very important. All the lessons, they are both lessons of the day, but then they are long-term things that you have to learn from that moment and work on. And when I was giving examples of different movements that were inspired online, that's why I began saying that these were building on already things that were already in society, already being fought for. There's this, with technology and everything looking like it's new, there's this temptation to think that what you're doing is new, but we know that, or the impact you're doing is quite new, but we know there's nothing new under the sun, especially in terms of changing life, is the fact that many people have been doing it. You have to build on what you found, dismantle some of that which you found, and build on those good practices that you found. So for me, it's more than just participating in a hashtag. It's like, how do you sustain action beyond the online world? That's why, like, the words are merging. It's not just what you're doing here, but more. And it doesn't mean that whoever is doing something online is not doing anything. It's like, how are you making sure you connect with those who are doing it? We can't do everything. There's this idea that, oh, if you're online, you're doing nothing. It's not true. It's more interconnectedness. What connections are you making? Because there are people in the communities who are doing that. How are you able to connect with them that in a way that they can now transmit that moment into actual change in the lives of the people? And we have also to appreciate that change is gradual. For change that feminists seek is actually gradual, because you're fighting systems. It's not about just that hashtag.
Thank you once again, ma'am. Since we are running short of time, I'll just ask one last question. This is by one of our faculty members, Meher Fatima Zain, Dr. Meher Fatima, actually. And she has firstly extended her vote of thanks for such a nuanced talk. And she goes on to ask, how is Ugandan government responding to changing religious turf, particularly Islamic feminism, and particularly on issue of female genital mutilation? Is there digital resistance to such issues where culture intersects identities?
Oh, so we have different issues, right? Islamic feminism, right? And then we have FGM, yeah? And if I'm hearing correctly, I'm just clarifying, then we also have intersex issues, right? Or intersecting. I couldn't hear properly. If you can clarify.
Ma'am, it's
just the issues.
How culture intersects with identities. Intersection.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So I think in the case of Uganda, so the law in Uganda, Muslims have laws that govern their, marriage, property, marriage, and certain ceremonies that are guarded in terms of the constitution for certain religions. But at the end of the day, the Ugandan constitution is always the supreme law of the land. So any law has to be in so much that somebody's rights are upheld, and where questions arise, if the members they can be held internally, if the internal mechanisms within the Islamic leadership is not possible, then they can come to the highest court of the land to determine whatever is going on. But female genital mutilation in Uganda is not actually it's not connected to religion. It is in very small cultural communities who are not even one religion. It's very based on the ethnicity of the person. That's the difference, in Uganda. And because there are few communities practicing FGM in Uganda, it's outlawed and it's punishable as a prison sentences. Of course, you can question or the idea of incarceration and prison system if you're looking at it from abolitionist framework. But at the end of the day, in Uganda right now, they are taking that approach of the law is there, but also going to communities and doing education among communities. But again, because this is practiced by small ethnicities, I think less than 10% of Uganda, honestly. So it was easier for, for example, the Ugandan parliament to ban FGM because it was not seen as controversial for almost 90% of the population. So but also the people in those cultures, they were many of them were still supportive of the move to criminalize FGM. So it's in that way, it's not one of the most controversial because of those dynamics of ethnicity and kind of population percentages within the society. But it's still a big problem. But although we still have legally it's banned, but we know that practices take many years to defeat long after they've been criminalized. Because also on one side you don't want to uphold the idea of policing as a solution to human behavior, but also advancing consciousness, and so that communities can in the end change gradually. But in Uganda, for sure, FGM is outlawed. I don't know if I've answered that. For many, I know for many Islamic women who are feminists who are participating, they carry a bit of a double burden because of the sometimes the law the law is the dispensation of the law is very patriarchal. So if the people you're bargaining power from who are leaders are men in the religion, then it becomes difficult, especially in a country where they say, but also Muslims being a minority. So you will find people saying, those are your issues, sort them out there. So women will suffer, will find it a hard time because the mainstream legal system will be adamant to tackle their issues in many ways. They say, oh no, that is your religion, go and sort it out in that manner. But at the same time, they've also fought to secure certain rights. And it is helped the fact that the constitution is the supreme law of Uganda, no matter your religion or ethnicity. So they can find recourse within, or rather it's been a difficult journey, but they still can find recourse in the mainstream law. And the Ugandan constitution is fairly in most instances, very on paper at least, very, very advancing equality in most spheres of life. Yeah.
Ma'am, you're absolutely right. Being a woman has multiple layers of discrimination, and religion kind of adds to it. Now, thank you so much for all your answers, ma'am. They were really insightful. Now, I would like to invite Chetali for a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, bro.
She will
Thank
present
you,
the report
Elvira.
first. She will
Yeah,
present the
yeah.
report first. Yeah.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Elvira. Thank you, Professor Zeddy. Thank you, Miss Rosebell. This was incredibly insightful. Um, as we come to the close of this enriching and intellectually stimulating conference, it is my privilege to reflect on the remarkable journey that we've had over the past couple of days. And this conference commenced with great enthusiasm with inaugural session graced by our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Jamia Millia Islamia, and a welcome address, followed by a welcome address delivered by Professor Zeddy. We were honored to have Professor Pillai deliver her first keynote address, which was a profound foundation of the themes that were coming up in the conference. Over the course of these days, we witnessed 9 technical sessions covering a wide range of themes from gender studies, information technology, policy analysis, social development, and all of the other key areas which I might not be able to remember as such, showcasing the depth and the diversity of scholarship that have been brought forth by the researchers that have joined us from across the globe, from Africa, Sri Lanka, China, to a lot of other countries. And these sessions have been a platform for rich discussions, thought provoking questions, and the exchange of innovative ideas. Our distinguished keynote speakers, Professor Shraf and Professor Wale, offered invaluable perspectives, enriching our understanding furthermore. We're equally grateful to Dr. Abhiruchi Ojha, Ms. Athira for their engaging and insightful presentations, which added more depth to our deliberation as women's studies, gender studies scholars. As we conclude this conference, I am delighted to acknowledge its successful completion. Thanks to the dedication and collective effort of our organizing team. Thanks to Professor Zedi for the support, the enthusiastic participation of the scholars worldwide, the volunteer team that has been at it when needed the most, and giving us the space to really take a breather. And I am confident that the collaborations initiated here will continue to grow beyond this platform. Let us carry forward the spirit of inquiry and the commitment to meaningful research as we move ahead. Special thanks to the Advisory Committee of SNCWS and our extended staff. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Chaitali. So, with that, we come to the end of the conference. Thanks, Rosebell, for joining. Now, may I request Shubhangi to switch off the recording?